My husband Brandon laughed when his boss praised our new eco-home. Not a polite chuckle, but a booming laugh that echoed off the ceilings I had drafted myself. "Sarah," he smirked, "she just picks curtains. Look at this dinner, so melodramatic and folksy. She plays house while I do the real work." The guests shifted uncomfortably. I stood there, the hot serving dish in my hands, but inside everything had completely frozen. What time and where do you usually listen to podcasts? Let me know in the comments if this resonates with you. I didn't say a word. The dining room fell into an awkward, suffocating silence. The clinking of expensive silverware against fine china completely stopped. I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the smart home ventilation system I had personally calibrated, a quiet backdrop to the utter humiliation unfolding at my own dining table. Kevin, one of Brandon's senior colleagues, cleared his throat and took a slow, deliberate sip of his water. His wife, Jessica, suddenly found her roasted asparagus absolutely fascinating, but Brandon was not finished. Having successfully belittled my culinary efforts and my architectural contributions, his gaze shifted down the long, polished oak table. It landed on Bella. Bella is 17 years old. She is my niece, but practically my daughter. She came to live with us 3 years ago after my older sister passed away in a tragic accident. She is quiet, incredibly bright, and tries so hard to shrink herself down so she does not take up too much space in Brandon's immaculate world. She was sitting at the far end of the table wearing a simple navy dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When Brandon's eyes locked onto her, I saw her posture stiffen. "And don't even get me started on the absolute financial drain of raising a teenager," Brandon announced, leaning back in his custom leather chair and swirling his scotch. He was speaking to his boss, Marcus, but his voice was loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. "The college fund alone. It is an absolute sunk cost, pouring money into an art degree for a kid who barely speaks. It is like throwing cash directly into a fireplace. But you know, I shoulder the burden. I provide." The cruelty of the statement hung in the air like toxic smoke. He was not just insulting me anymore. He was attacking a grieving, vulnerable teenager who had done absolutely nothing but exist. I watched Bella's face turn a devastating shade of pale. Her lower lip trembled slightly and she immediately dropped her gaze to her lap, her thick hair falling forward to hide her absolute shame. She looked like she wanted the floor to swallow her whole. A sharp electric jolt traveled down my spine. For years, I had conditioned myself to absorb his passive-aggressive remarks. I had built a heavy emotional armor to deflect his constant need to diminish my worth. But looking at Bella's crushed expression, that armor did not just crack. It completely shattered. The illusion of my marriage dissolved in a single, irreversible heartbeat. I did not burst into tears. I did not drop the heavy serving dish. I did not scream at him in front of his colleagues. Instead, a profound, terrifying wave of absolute clarity washed over me. I walked calmly to the center of the table and set the dish down with perfect, measured grace. I smoothed the front of my dress. I looked directly into Brandon's smug, flushed face. I offered him a chilled, polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "You are exactly right, Brandon," I said, my voice steady and smooth. "This is an absolute waste." He smirked, thinking I was agreeing about the dinner. He had no idea I was talking about our entire life together. That was the exact moment at 8:30 in the evening. That was the moment I decided to systematically dismantle his life. I would take everything. The sheer audacity of his entitlement did not develop overnight. It was built on a foundation of secrets he knew absolutely nothing about. To understand the depth of his delusion, you have to look back at a quiet, unassuming Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks before this disastrous anniversary dinner. The autumn rain was tapping gently against the large glass windows of the small spare bedroom I used as a home office. I was sitting at my desk, a cup of black coffee cooling beside my laptop. The screen was filled with complex financial dashboards glowing green and red with market fluctuations. I was meticulously analyzing asset allocations, moving diversified funds into a highly secure private portfolio. It was an irrevocable trust, heavily shielded and quietly growing. Over the years, I had successfully compounded the balance to a staggering $450,000. This was our retirement safety net. Or at least it was supposed to be. While Brandon spent his enormous corporate bonuses on leased luxury cars, tailored Italian suits, and extravagant weekend golf trips to maintain his pristine executive image, I had been quietly consulting. I took on independent architectural drafting contracts under a discreet limited liability company. Every single dollar I earned went directly into this fund. I drove an older sedan. I wore practical clothes. I sacrificed my own immediate comfort to ensure we would never face financial ruin when his corporate bubble inevitably popped. I was just finalizing a lucrative bond transfer when the heavy oak door swung open without a knock. Brandon marched in, already complaining about the morning traffic on the interstate. He tossed his expensive leather briefcase onto the small daybed, not even bothering to look at me. He loosened his silk tie with a dramatic sigh, playing the role of the exhausted, burdened provider to absolute perfection. "I do not understand how you can just sit here all day," he grumbled, glancing at the back of my laptop screen. "I am out there breaking my back, navigating corporate politics, dealing with Marcus, securing the funding that pays for this massive house. And you are in here what? Playing games on the computer, browsing online catalogs." I did not minimize the financial windows. I simply closed the laptop lid with a soft click. I looked at him, taking in his tailored suit and his arrogant posture. I was holding nearly $500,000 in liquid assets that I had built from the ground up entirely to protect his reckless lifestyle. Yet, in his eyes, I was nothing more than a lazy dependent, a freeloader who contributed absolutely nothing of value to our shared existence. "Just managing some household budgets," I replied calmly. "Well, try not to spend it all on organic vegetables and throw pillows," he scoffed, turning on his heel and walking out of the room to pour himself a drink. He walked away feeling deeply superior. He genuinely believed he was the undisputed king of our financial castle. He had absolutely no idea that the computer screen he had just mocked was holding his entire future. His complete lack of gratitude was astonishing. He was standing on a mountain I had quietly built, claiming he had touched the sky all by himself. He had mocked my safety net. I would sink his ship. As the anniversary dinner painfully dragged on toward dessert, I sat quietly at the edge of the table, sipping a glass of sparkling water. The conversation flowed around me, mostly driven by Brandon's exaggerated tales of corporate conquests. I watched him perform. I watched him charm Marcus and Kevin, leaning in, laughing at his own jokes, portraying himself as the brilliant mastermind behind our stunning, eco-friendly home. Sitting there in the warm glow of the pendant lights, a deep, analytical part of my brain began to dissect the architecture of my own misery. How did I end up here? How does a brilliant, independent woman voluntarily step into a cage and hand over the key? It was not a sudden capture. It was a slow, methodical psychological conditioning. It was the brutal trap of normalization. Years ago, when we first met, we were equal partners. We were both ambitious, both climbing our respective ladders. But when his firm offered him a massive promotion that required frequent travel and endless networking, he sat me down with a gentle, loving smile. He held my hands and told me we were a team. He needed a strong foundation. He asked me to step back just a little, to manage the construction of our dream home and handle the domestic logistics so he could secure our financial empire. "I cannot do this without you, Sarah," he had whispered. "You are the backbone of my success." I believed him. I loved him. So I compromised. I scaled back my public career. I took the freelance route. I poured my genius into the blueprints of this house, turning it into a masterpiece of sustainable design. I made his life completely frictionless. But the tragedy of unseen labor is that it quickly becomes expected, and expected labor eventually becomes invisible. The moment he tasted real executive power, the narrative shifted. The team dissolved. My sacrifices were no longer appreciated. They were weaponized against me. Because my work did not come with a fancy corporate title, a corner office, or a public awards ceremony, he decided it had no value. He began to view my presence at home not as a strategic partnership, but as a lack of ambition. He successfully gaslit me into believing that my primary worth was tied to my ability to support him. Every time he belittled my cooking, every time he minimized my architectural work as picking curtains, he was actively reinforcing the idea that I was dependent on his greatness. And the most terrifying part was that for a long time I had accepted it. I had normalized his casual cruelty because I thought it was just the stress of his job. But watching him publicly humiliate Bella, the fog completely lifted. The manipulation was so clear, so painfully obvious. He did not want a partner. He wanted a prop. He wanted a mirror that only reflected his own magnified ego. I had spent a decade building a beautiful, comfortable life for a man who despised me for providing it. The cage was incredibly beautiful. I finally found the key. The front door finally clicked shut behind the last guest at exactly 11 o'clock. The heavy silence of the large house immediately rushed in, replacing the fake laughter and the clinking of wine glasses. Brandon did not even bother to say goodbye to Marcus at the door. He had already retreated to the living room, loosening his tie and pouring himself yet another glass of scotch. "Well, that was exhausting," Brandon muttered, not looking in my direction. "You really need to work on your conversational skills, Sarah. You barely said 2 words to Marcus's wife. It makes me look bad when my wife acts like a mute servant." He drained his glass, set it heavily on the marble coffee table, and headed toward the master staircase. "Clean up this mess before you come to bed. The smell of those ridiculous candles is giving me a massive headache." He disappeared up the stairs. I stood perfectly still in the center of the devastated dining room. Wrinkled linen napkins, half-eaten plates of expensive food, and empty wine bottles cluttered the beautiful oak table. A few months ago, his words would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt. I would have quietly cried over the sink, wondering how I could be better, how I could make him love me the way he used to. But tonight my tear ducts were completely dry. There was no sorrow left, only a cold, calculating emptiness. I moved toward the table and began to clear the plates. I scraped the remnants of a meal that took me 4 hours to prepare straight into the garbage disposal. I washed the crystal glasses with meticulous, rhythmic precision. I wiped down the counters until they gleamed under the recessed lighting. I was not cleaning to be a submissive, obedient wife. I was not operating out of fear or a desperate need for his approval. I was cleaning to systematically erase the physical evidence of the woman I used to be. Every plate I washed felt like stripping away a layer of my learned helplessness. The psychological chains that had bound me to his emotional abuse were snapping one by one, dissolving down the kitchen drain. When the kitchen was absolutely spotless, the digital clock on the microwave blinked 2 in the morning. I dried my hands on a fresh towel. I did not walk toward the master bedroom where my husband was deeply asleep, completely unaware of the massive internal shift that had just occurred beneath his roof. Instead, I walked silently up the secondary stairs toward my home office. I closed the heavy door and locked it with a soft click. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. The screen illuminated the dark room with a harsh, bright light. I bypassed my architectural software and opened a brand new, completely blank spreadsheet. Column A for the exact date. Column B for the detailed incident description. Column C for the specific financial impact. The quiet quitting had officially ended. The silent preparation had begun. The spreadsheet was now open. The morning sun broke through the heavy blinds of my office, casting long, sharp shadows across the hardwood floor. It was exactly 6 in the morning. For the past 10 years, this was the exact moment I would quietly go down to the pristine kitchen. I would grind the imported coffee beans, Brandon demanded, iron his luxury dress shirts, and pack his meticulously portioned executive lunch. I did none of those things today. Instead, I stood in front of the heavy steel safe, hidden behind a false panel in my walk-in closet. I entered the 6-digit combination with steady fingers. The heavy door swung open with a muted, satisfying click. Inside, resting beneath a stack of old architectural blueprints, was a thick, fireproof envelope. I pulled it out, the rough texture of the heavy paper grounding me in reality. It smelled faintly of old leather and pipe tobacco. It smelled exactly like my father. My father was a brilliant, uncompromising forensic accountant. He spent 30 years unraveling complex financial frauds for massive international corporations. He was a quiet, highly observant man who never raised his voice, but who could absolutely destroy a corrupt executive with a single printed bank statement. When I married Brandon, my father had smiled politely at the wedding, but his eyes were constantly calculating. He saw through the charm. A year before he passed away, he called me into his dark, oak-paneled study. He handed me this exact envelope and forced me to sign a stack of highly complex legal documents. He helped me establish an irrevocable trust. It was a financial fortress made of federal laws and airtight clauses. People can smile to your face while they steal your entire future. Sarah, he had told me, his voice calm and incredibly steady. People will always lie to get what they want, but the numbers never do. I opened the envelope and spread the pristine documents across my desk. The trust currently held the $450,000 I had secretly earned and invested over the years. It was completely untouched. It was fully protected by federal jurisdiction. Brandon's name was nowhere on these pages. He had no legal authority to even acknowledge its existence, let alone touch a single cent. I ran my fingers over my father's bold signature on the final page of the agreement. He had given me an incredibly powerful financial shield. But to completely dismantle Brandon's impending attack, I needed a sword. I needed someone who understood the ruthless nature of modern financial warfare just as well as my father did. I picked up my phone. At 7:15, I heard heavy footsteps stomping aggressively down the hallway. Brandon threw open the bedroom door, his face flushed with morning irritation. He was wearing his expensive trousers but no shirt, clearly expecting his freshly pressed Egyptian cotton button-down to be hanging on the closet door waiting for him. "Sarah, where is my blue shirt? And why isn't the coffee on?" he demanded, leaning against the doorframe like a petulant child. I did not look up from the trust documents on my desk. I kept my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional inflection. "I am not doing your laundry anymore, and the coffee machine is downstairs in the kitchen." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open in genuine confusion. He was so incredibly accustomed to my instant compliance that my simple refusal completely short-circuited his brain. "What is your problem today?" he sneered, stepping into the room. "Are you throwing a tantrum because I embarrassed you in front of Marcus last night? Grow up, Sarah. I have a massive corporate presentation at 9 o'clock. "Then you should probably get dressed," I replied smoothly, finally making eye contact. He cursed loudly under his breath, slammed the door, and stomped heavily down the stairs. I listened to him aggressively rummaging through the kitchen cabinets before the heavy front door slammed shut, shaking the walls. The house was finally quiet again. I picked up my phone and scrolled to a number I had not dialed in nearly 3 years. Harold was my father's oldest colleague, a senior partner at a prestigious downtown wealth management firm. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I told him absolutely everything. I detailed the financial manipulation, the public humiliation, and the subtle, insidious gaslighting that had defined my marriage. Harold listened in complete professional silence. When I finished, I heard a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Your father always suspected he was a hollow suit," Harold said quietly. "He made me promise to keep a very close eye on that trust of yours. You are ready to pull the trigger, aren't you?" I looked out the window at the beautifully manicured lawn I had paid for with my own freelance money. "I am ready to burn his financial kingdom to the ground, Harold. I need the most ruthless family law attorney in the city, someone who understands forensic asset tracking." "I know exactly who you need," Harold replied without a second of hesitation. "Her name is Grace. She does not play games, and she destroys men like Brandon for sport. I will make the introduction today." The board was set. That afternoon, I was sitting at the kitchen island, quietly reviewing some structural blueprints for a new private client when my phone vibrated against the marble counter. It was a secure notification from our joint banking application. A withdrawal of $35,000 had just been processed. I stared at the digital receipt glowing on the screen. Brandon was endlessly arrogant, but he was rarely this reckless with large amounts of liquid cash during the middle of the month. My father's rigorous training immediately kicked into high gear. I opened my laptop and logged directly into the main banking portal using the master administrative credentials I had maintained since the beginning of our marriage. Brandon always claimed he was far too busy with corporate strategy to handle the mundane household accounts, effectively handing me the digital keys to his entire financial history. I opened the transaction ledger and immediately tracked the routing number. The money had not gone to a luxury car dealership or a high-end golf resort for his executives. It had been wired electronically to a small, obscure regional bank on the other side of the state. I opened a new browser tab and began digging into the public business registries and corporate tax databases. It took me less than 40 minutes to completely unravel his clumsy attempt at financial camouflage. The $35,000 had been deposited into a newly formed limited liability company called Blue Horizon Consulting. I pulled the public incorporation documents and scrolled down to the executive summary. The registered agent and primary shareholder was a woman named Diane. Diane was Brandon's mother. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the cold, hard reality settling over me like a heavy blanket. He was not just buying expensive toys behind my back anymore. He was actively siphoning our marital assets. He was intentionally hiding money in a shell company managed by his mother. This was a classic, desperate move made by greedy men who were quietly preparing to file for divorce. He was trying to drain the joint accounts so he could claim extreme financial hardship during the impending settlement negotiations. He wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing while he secured his own future. I felt a strange, chilling sense of total calm wash over my entire body. He was playing checkers, completely unaware that I had been playing a high-stakes game of chess for years. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single transaction, every routing number, and every incorporation document. I organized them meticulously into a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I labeled the folder Exhibit A. I did not confront him when he came home. I did not send him an angry text message demanding an explanation. I just smiled at the screen. He was digging his own grave. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously cross-referencing every bank statement from the past 14 months. The $35,000 was not an isolated incident. It was simply the largest and most recent transaction in a long, undeniable pattern of financial abuse. I found multiple smaller transfers, disguised as consulting fees and legal retainers, all funneling quietly into Diane's shell company. Brandon was systematically bleeding our joint savings dry. Assuming I was too entirely focused on picking out curtains and making dinner to ever notice the disappearing funds. I opened my master spreadsheet. Column A, date. Column B, transaction amount. Column C, routing destination. Column D, legal implication. I entered the data with the cold mechanical precision of a surgeon operating on a severely diseased organ. Every single keystroke was a silent declaration of war. By the time I finished logging the final fraudulent transfer, the total amount of missing marital assets exceeded $80,000. He thought he was being an untouchable mastermind. But a forensic accountant's daughter knows that money never actually disappears. It simply changes hands, and it always leaves a digital footprint. I backed up the entire encrypted folder to 3 separate cloud servers and copied it onto 2 physical flash drives. One drive went directly into the steel safe in my closet. The other drive went into my purse, securely zipped in a hidden compartment. The sheer audacity of his plan was almost insulting. He genuinely believed I was a naive, dependent housewife who would simply weep and accept whatever meager settlement his lawyers eventually offered. He did not realize that I understood the intricate architecture of financial law better than he understood his own corporate spreadsheets. I walked downstairs to pour myself a glass of iced tea. The house was immaculate, perfectly designed, and incredibly silent. I looked around at the custom bamboo flooring, the energy-efficient glass panels, and the structural beams I had personally calculated to withstand maximum environmental stress. This house was my masterpiece. It was the physical manifestation of my talent and my relentless hard work, and Brandon was trying to steal it right out from under me, using his mother as a pathetic financial shield. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the cold liquid slide down my throat. The anger I had felt during the anniversary dinner had completely evaporated. It was replaced by something much more dangerous. It was replaced by absolute unwavering purpose. I was not just going to divorce him. I was going to legally and financially dismantle him. I was going to expose his fraud, reclaim my intellectual property, and secure Bella's future. The preparation phase was officially complete. Now I just had to wait. Brandon returned home shortly after 7 in the evening. The heavy front door slammed shut, vibrating through the quiet house. He marched straight into the kitchen, his face contorted in a mask of manufactured outrage. He slammed his expensive leather briefcase onto the marble island, narrowly missing my laptop. Bella, who had been sitting quietly at the counter doing her advanced calculus homework, physically jumped at the sudden noise. "We need to talk about finances," Sarah Brandon demanded, his voice echoing sharply in the open concept room. "I was reviewing the household budget today, and the amount of money you are wasting on Bella's extracurriculars and her private tutoring is absolutely absurd. It stops immediately. I am cutting her allowance and canceling the college prep courses." Bella's eyes widened in sheer panic. She looked at her textbooks, then up at me, her hands trembling slightly. Brandon puffed out his chest, clearly expecting me to beg to plead with him to spare my niece. He was trying to establish absolute dominance, using a vulnerable teenager as a weapon to punish me for my lack of compliance that morning. I closed my laptop with a soft, deliberate click. I stood up slowly, ensuring my posture was perfectly straight. I walked around the island and stood directly between Brandon and my niece. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of intimidation. I looked into his eyes with a gaze so incredibly cold it made him momentarily step back. "You will not cancel a single thing, Brandon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of an absolute command. "Her education is not up for negotiation, and you will never speak about her as a financial burden in this house ever again." "Excuse me," he scoffed, recovering his arrogance. "I pay the bills around here. I make the decisions. She is a massive drain on my resources." "Your resources," I tilted my head slightly, offering him a hollow, terrifying smile. "That is a very interesting choice of words, but let me make this incredibly simple for you. Bella's tuition for the next 4 years of university has already been fully paid in advance, from an account you do not have access to and a fund you will never touch." His face went completely pale. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by profound confusion and a flicker of genuine fear. "What are you talking about? What account?" I turned away from him, completely dismissing his presence, as if he were a minor inconvenience. I placed a gentle hand on Bella's shoulder. "Pack up your books, sweetheart. We are going out for dinner tonight." I looked back at Brandon one last time. "Enjoy the empty house." The following morning, I drove downtown to a sleek, glass-paneled, high-rise building. The law offices of Grace & Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor. The reception area was intimidatingly quiet, decorated in minimalist slate and brushed steel. I was ushered into a corner conference room overlooking the gray waters of the Puget Sound. Grace walked in exactly on time. She was in her early 50s, wearing a sharp charcoal suit, her silver hair pulled back into a severe knot. She did not offer me a warm, comforting hug. She offered me a firm handshake and a very sharp gaze. I sat across from her at the massive mahogany table. I didn't waste time crying about my broken marriage or complaining about my husband's massive ego. I simply unzipped my leather tote bag and placed the encrypted flash drive and a neatly bound printed summary of the Excel spreadsheet on the table. "My husband is systematically funneling marital assets into a newly incorporated shell company managed by his mother," I stated clearly, sliding the documents toward her. "He is also publicly claiming sole credit for the architectural design of our primary residence, which I drafted entirely by myself. Furthermore, I have a fully funded, legally binding, irrevocable trust established by my late father, which Brandon knows absolutely nothing about." Grace pushed her reading glasses up the bridge of her nose and opened the thick folder. The room was perfectly silent for 15 minutes. I watched her eyes track across the meticulously documented bank transfers, the routing numbers, and the LLC incorporation papers. I watched her read through the airtight clauses of my father's trust. When she finally reached the last page, she closed the folder and folded her hands on top of it. A slow, highly predatory smile spread across her face. "You are a very rare type of client," Sarah Grace said, her voice smooth and deeply appreciative. "Most people come into this office drowning in emotion, looking for a therapist. You came in here acting like a forensic auditor looking for an executioner." "My father was a forensic accountant," I replied simply. "He taught me that tears do not win settlements. Documentation does." Grace nodded in absolute agreement. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the folder. "Brandon thinks he is starving you out. He thinks he is quietly draining the reservoir before he cuts off the water supply completely. But he doesn't realize he is standing in the middle of a desert and you own the only oasis." We spent the next 2 hours outlining the precise legal strategy. We would not confront him. We would not demand the money back. We would let him continue to feel like an absolute genius right up until the moment we dropped the legal guillotine on his neck. The quiet quitting was over. The trap was officially set. On Tuesday morning, after Brandon left for his corporate office in his leased luxury sedan, I executed the next phase of the strategy. I drove to a quiet private bank branch in a neighboring town, a financial institution Brandon had never used and knew absolutely nothing about. I sat down with a senior account manager and opened a brand new, entirely separate checking and savings account under my own name. The first thing I did was officially reroute all future income from my independent architectural LLC directly into this new secure account. Brandon would never see another dime of my freelance money. But the second transaction was far more important. I authorized a massive direct wire transfer from my private funds straight to the university bursar's office. I paid for the entire remaining 4 years of Bella's architecture degree in one single, non-refundable lump sum. The money was officially locked in the university's system, legally earmarked exclusively for her tuition and mandatory fees. It was completely untouchable by any divorce court, any greedy husband, or any vindictive legal maneuver. Sitting in that quiet bank office watching the confirmation receipt print out, a massive weight lifted off my chest. For the past 3 years, Brandon had constantly used Bella's financial dependency as a psychological weapon against me. He dangled her future over my head to enforce my absolute compliance. He genuinely believed that if I ever stepped out of line, he could ruin a 17-year-old girl's life with the stroke of a pen. I folded the heavy paper receipt and placed it carefully into my purse. The weapon had been entirely neutralized. Bella was safe. Her future was permanently secured, completely independent of Brandon's fragile ego and his rapidly depleting bank accounts. When I returned to the Bellevue Eco Home that afternoon, the vast, empty house felt different. It no longer felt like a beautiful, expensive prison. It felt like a staging ground. I walked through the massive living room, admiring the natural light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling glass panels I had personally calculated the solar heat gain for. I realized I did not hate the house. I simply hated the man who occupied it. I had built this sanctuary with my own 2 hands and my own brilliant mind. I had poured my creative soul into every single joint and fixture, and I was absolutely not going to let a mediocre corporate manager take it away from me. I went up to my office and locked the door. I had secured the cash. I had protected my niece. Now I needed to legally lock down the most valuable asset in the entire marital portfolio, my intellectual property. The shield was fully raised. It was time to start sharpening the blade. Wednesday night was dedicated entirely to digital extraction. I sat at my high-powered workstation, the dual monitors casting a cool blue light across my face. Brandon was downstairs in the media room, loudly watching a basketball game and completely ignoring my existence. His shouting at the television screen felt like a distant, irrelevant background noise. I was operating in a state of absolute serene focus. I opened the massive, encrypted archive containing the original AutoCAD files for the Bellevue Eco Home. These were not just drawings, they were the digital DNA of the property. I carefully extracted the raw metadata from the very first draft of the foundation plan. The digital timestamp clearly showed the file was created 3 years ago on my personal workstation, linked exclusively to my unique user license. But I knew a smart lawyer might argue that drafting a house during a marriage made it a joint asset. I needed something far more concrete. I needed undeniable proof of sole authorship. I dove into my archived email servers. I pulled up the extensive years-long communication threads with the structural engineers, the custom glass manufacturers, and the sustainable materials suppliers. Every single email was addressed directly to me. Every technical question, every major design revision, and every final approval came exclusively from my email address. Brandon's name was never copied on a single technical document. He had absolutely zero involvement in the actual creation of the home he so proudly bragged about. I compiled hundreds of pages of raw data, technical specifications, and digitally stamped blueprints. I organized them into a massive, undeniable portfolio of intellectual property. This was not just a house anymore. It was a copyrighted commercial design. By Brandon claiming he designed it to his boss and his corporate partners, he wasn't just being an arrogant husband. He was legally exposing himself to corporate fraud. I encrypted the massive file and sent it directly to Grace's secure legal portal. At 10:30, Brandon finally stumbled upstairs. He pushed open my office door without knocking. He looked at me sitting calmly at my desk, my screen showing nothing but a generic architectural blog. Still playing around on the computer, he sneered, leaning against the doorframe. "Did you even make dinner, or am I supposed to starve while you pretend to work?" "There is leftover chicken in the fridge," I said, my voice completely devoid of any emotion. He rolled his eyes and scoffed loudly. Useless. Absolutely useless. He walked away completely blind to the reality of his situation. He was a man standing proudly on a frozen lake, aggressively swinging a sledgehammer at the ice beneath his own feet. My mind was completely clear. I felt absolutely no anger toward him anymore. You do not feel angry at a sinking ship. You simply step off onto the lifeboat and watch it go down. The digital trap was fully constructed. The illusion finally shattered on a Friday evening. Brandon burst through the front door just after 6 o'clock, his face flushed, sweating profusely despite the cool autumn air. He was carrying a bouquet of cheap plastic-wrapped carnations from a local gas station. They were the kind of flowers you buy in an absolute panic, already wilting at the edges. I was sitting comfortably at the kitchen island sipping a cup of chamomile tea and reviewing a contract for a new client. Bella was upstairs studying. Sarah Brandon gasped, practically throwing the cheap flowers onto the pristine marble counter. "I need your help." "It is an absolute emergency." I slowly turned a page of my contract. I did not reach for the flowers. "What seems to be the problem?" He ran a frantic hand through his perfectly styled hair, completely losing his composed executive persona. "Marcus just called." He was so impressed with the house at the anniversary dinner that he pitched it to the editors of Pacific Northwest Architecture magazine. They want to do a massive feature spread on the property, and they want to interview me as the lead designer. I took a very slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The sheer, unadulterated arrogance required to steal my work and then ask me to help him showcase it to a magazine was almost breathtaking. "They are sending a full photography crew and a journalist here next Wednesday," he continued, his voice rising in panic. "I need you to completely stage the house, deep clean everything, buy new accent furniture, make it look exactly like a professional showroom. And when the journalist gets here, I need you to play the supportive wife and stay out of the camera shots." He looked at me, breathing heavily, fully expecting me to jump up, grab a mop, and start frantically preparing to polish his stolen crown. I gently set my teacup down on a coaster. I looked at the pathetic, dying carnations on the counter, and then I looked directly into his panicked, demanding eyes. "No," I said simply. Brandon froze. He blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process a single one-syllable word. "What do you mean, no, Sarah? This is a massive career opportunity for me. Marcus is watching this closely. You have to do this." "I do not have to do anything, Brandon," I replied, my voice completely flat and unbothered. "I am not your maid. I am not your staging assistant. And I am certainly not going to help you commit public intellectual property fraud in a major architectural publication." His face shifted from panic to absolute explosive rage. "You ungrateful lazy, I provide everything for you. You owe me this." He was shouting so loudly, the crystal glasses in the cabinets faintly rattled. I remained perfectly seated. The contrast between his frantic, screaming desperation and my total chilling silence filled the room. He had no power here anymore. I reached for my leather bag. Brandon stood in the center of the kitchen, his face contorted in an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered fury. He continued to scream, hurling insults about my worth, my career, and my supposed complete dependence on his massive intellect and his corporate paycheck. He ranted about how I was nothing without him, how he had built this entire life from scratch, while I simply reaped the luxurious benefits. I let him scream. I let him completely exhaust his vocabulary of abuse. When he finally paused to take a harsh, ragged breath, I calmly unzipped my leather tote bag. I reached inside and pulled out a pristine, beautifully bound legal document. It was printed on heavy, high-quality paper, secured with a crisp blue backing. I placed it gently onto the marble kitchen island, sliding it perfectly into place, right next to his pathetic, dying gas station carnations. Brandon stared at the document. The bold black letters at the very top of the page were impossible to misinterpret: petition for dissolution of marriage. The color drained from his face so fast he looked physically ill. The shouting stopped, instantly replaced by a suffocating heavy silence. He looked from the papers to me, his eyes wide with genuine shock. He had expected me to eventually cry. He had expected me to complain. He had never in a million years expected me to coldly hand him divorce papers while he was demanding I clean the house. "You have exactly 30 days to respond to the court," I said, my voice as smooth and cold as the marble counter between us. "My attorney Grace has already served a copy to your corporate office. The magazine shoot on Wednesday is canceled. If you attempt to claim my architectural design in any publication, I will immediately file an injunction for commercial fraud." The shock only lasted for about 10 seconds. Then his massive ego fiercely, violently kicked back in to protect him from reality. "You are insane," he hissed, his hands physically shaking as he pointed at the papers. "You think you can just walk away and take my money. You think you can steal my house. I will destroy you, Sarah. I am going to hire Arthur Sterling. He is the most vicious, expensive divorce attorney in Seattle. He will legally bury you. You will walk out of this marriage with absolutely nothing." I did not flinch. I did not argue. I just offered him a polite, chilling smile. "I look forward to meeting Arthur," I said quietly. I picked up my teacup and walked out of the kitchen, leaving him alone with his dying flowers and his impending ruin. Have you ever dealt with someone who shamelessly takes credit for your hard work? Let me know your story in the comments below. The war was officially declared. The following Monday morning, Grace forwarded me an email directly from Arthur's prestigious law office. It contained their official legal response and a massive, aggressively worded counterclaim. Brandon was not just fighting the divorce proceedings. He was actively trying to legally annihilate me. I opened the heavy PDF file and read through the document with a cup of hot black tea in my hand. It was an absolute masterclass in vicious legal fiction. Arthur had painted a portrait of a completely parasitic wife. The document claimed I had essentially abandoned all of my marital duties, contributed absolutely nothing to the household finances for a decade, and spent my days lounging in luxury while my husband built our wealth from nothing. Furthermore, the counterclaim demanded 100% ownership of the Bellevue Eco Home sole possession of all our joint savings accounts, and asked the judge to order me to pay Brandon's exorbitant legal fees. I sat in my quiet office reading the deeply offensive allegations. They were designed to make me feel small, to make me panic and doubt my own reality. A few years ago, reading those calculated lies would have completely broken my heart. I would have felt the overwhelming need to defend my character, to scream that I was a good person who had sacrificed my entire career for his success. Today, they just confirmed exactly who he really was. I picked up my phone and called Grace. She answered immediately, and I could hear the faint sound of amusement in her sharp voice. "He is playing directly into our hands," Sarah Grace said smoothly, turning a page on her desk. When a spouse aggressively accuses you of extreme financial abandonment in a legal document, they automatically open the door for a complete, unrestricted forensic audit of all marital assets. He just gave us the key to his own vault. I smiled at the glowing screen of my laptop. "He wants to talk about financial contributions," I said softly. "I think it is time we show the court exactly where the money has been going." I opened my highly encrypted master folder. I selected the massive subfolder containing all the pristine documentation on his mother's shell company, the routed wire transfers, and the $35,000 he had just stolen. I dragged the file into our secure portal and sent it directly to Grace's private server. Brandon wanted a war over numbers. He had absolutely no idea he was fighting the daughter of a master auditor. "I received the files," Grace confirmed a minute later. "This is beautiful, Sarah. It is completely undeniable. I am going to have a very good time at the mediation table this Friday. Let him keep thinking he is winning," I replied. The trap closed tighter. The next day, I drove downtown to finalize our strategy. Grace was sitting at her massive mahogany conference table, spreading my original architectural blueprints across the polished wood. This was the exact moment we deployed the most lethal weapon in our arsenal. It was a concept that Brandon, in all his corporate arrogance, had completely failed to comprehend. Brandon assumes that because his name is on the mortgage and the county deed, he owns this house outright, Grace explained, pointing a silver pen at the intricate floor plans. He thinks real estate law is the only thing that matters here. But he is entirely forgetting about intellectual property law. I nodded, sliding a printed stack of digital metadata reports across the table. Every single line of this design is federally copyrighted to my architectural firm. I never transferred the intellectual rights to our joint estate. Exactly, Grace smiled, her eyes gleaming with predatory intelligence. Real estate law dictates who owns the physical bricks and the land, but intellectual property law dictates who owns the actual creation. Because he stood in front of Marcus and his corporate partners and verbally claimed he designed this eco-home, he committed a massive error. He did not just insult you, he committed commercial plagiarism. We reviewed the digital timestamps. My software automatically logged the creation date of every single draft, every structural calculation, and every material specification. The metadata proved that I had built the digital foundation of the house 3 full years before the physical ground was even broken. Brandon had absolutely zero digital footprint on the project. If he tries to fight us for the physical house, we will simply file a federal lawsuit against him for copyright infringement, Grace stated, leaning back in her leather chair. We will drag his entire corporate firm into the lawsuit, claiming they are using stolen intellectual property for their upcoming magazine feature. The legal damages for commercial theft of a multi-million-dollar design would instantly bankrupt him. I felt a profound sense of intellectual satisfaction. This was not a messy, emotional revenge filled with screaming matches and broken plates. This was justice delivered through cold, hard process. It was the absolute power of documentation. I had spent thousands of hours meticulously documenting my work, saving every email and securing every digital signature. Brandon had spent his time practicing his golf swing and buying cheap gas station flowers to manipulate me. He had built his entire kingdom on a foundation of sand, and I had quietly engineered the tidal wave. "He thinks he is an architect," I said quietly. "Let us show him the blueprints." The sword was sharpened. It was Thursday evening, the night before the mandatory mediation. The house was completely silent. Brandon had intentionally stayed at a hotel downtown, likely strategizing with Arthur and building his false confidence. Bella was safely asleep in her room, entirely unaware of the massive legal storm that was about to break over our lives. I sat in my office performing one final, exhaustive review of my father's irrevocable trust. The heavy parchment paper felt reassuring in my hands. The $450,000 I had secretly invested was perfectly safe. Grace had thoroughly verified every single clause. Because the trust was established by my father and legally isolated from my marital estate before the funds were compounded, it was a completely impenetrable fortress. Brandon could scream, he could threaten, and his lawyer could file 100 aggressive motions, but they could not legally touch a single cent of that money. It was the ultimate safety net woven from years of my silent labor and my father's brilliant foresight. I traced my finger over my dad's signature, feeling a deep, profound wave of gratitude. He had known I would need this. He had seen the subtle cracks in Brandon's character long before I ever did. If you have ever had to build a secret safety net to protect yourself from someone you loved, you know exactly how heavy that silent burden is. Please let me know in the comments if you relate to this feeling. I closed the folder and locked it securely in the safe. I did not feel nervous about tomorrow. I did not feel any lingering anxiety or fear of intimidation. When you walk into a negotiation, knowing you hold every single winning card, the emotional stakes completely disappear. It simply becomes a transaction, a highly necessary surgical removal of a toxic asset from your life. I walked over to the window and looked out at the dark, sprawling neighborhood. Brandon thought tomorrow was going to be a quick, brutal execution. He genuinely believed I would sit across from him weeping into a tissue while his aggressive lawyer bullied me into surrendering the house and walking away with nothing but my clothes. He had spent the last 10 years demanding that I shrink myself down to make him feel larger. He had demanded my silence, my absolute compliance, and my invisible labor. Tomorrow at 9 in the morning, the silence was finally going to end, but I would not raise my voice. I would simply let the paperwork speak for me. I turned off the light. I was ready. The mediation room at the downtown courthouse was intentionally devoid of any warmth. It featured pale gray walls, a heavy frosted glass door, and a massive cold steel conference table. Grace and I arrived exactly 10 minutes early. We sat on one side of the table, our legal files arranged with military precision. I wore a tailored navy suit, my posture perfectly straight, my expression completely unreadable. At exactly 9 o'clock, the heavy glass door swung open. Brandon walked in, flanked by Arthur. Brandon was wearing his best power suit, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He did not even look at me. He looked at the mediator, a tired-looking retired judge, and then he looked at Grace with a faint, dismissive smirk. Arthur was a tall, imposing man who clearly enjoyed intimidating opposing counsel. He unbuttoned his jacket, leaned aggressively over the table, and launched directly into his opening statement. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Let us save everyone some valuable time," Arthur began, his voice booming in the small room. "My client is the sole financial provider for this household. He built the wealth, he secured the mortgage, and he maintains the executive lifestyle. We are willing to be generous to expedite this process. We will offer Mrs. Sarah a lump sum of $40,000 to relocate, and she may keep her older vehicle. In exchange, she vacates the Bellevue property by the end of the week and waives all claims to the marital savings." Brandon leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He looked like a king granting a meager pardon to a treasonous peasant. He was waiting for me to react. He was waiting for the tears, the desperation, the frantic begging. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I looked at Grace and gave her a very slight, almost imperceptible nod. Grace did not raise her voice. She did not match Arthur's aggressive volume. She simply reached out and pulled the thick, heavy red folder to the center of the table. The sharp sound of the heavy cardboard hitting the steel table echoed like a gunshot. The temperature in the room seemed to immediately drop 10 degrees. "That is a very fascinating offer," Arthur Grace said, her tone dripping with polite, lethal condescension. "However, before we discuss your client's generosity, we need to discuss his impending liability for commercial fraud." Arthur stopped breathing. The execution had begun. Grace opened the red folder and smoothly slid a thick stack of digitally certified documents across the cold steel table. They came to rest precisely in front of Arthur. "You claim your client owns the Bellevue Eco Home," Grace said, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room. "However, the physical deed is currently irrelevant. Attached are the federal copyright certificates and the encrypted digital metadata for the entire architectural design of the property. Every blueprint, every structural calculation, and every custom specification is the sole protected intellectual property of my client's firm." Brandon frowned, dropping his arms from his chest. "What is she talking about? I paid the mortgage. It is my house." Grace ignored him completely, keeping her sharp gaze locked entirely on Arthur. "Your client recently presented this exact design to his senior corporate executives, claiming absolute sole authorship. He authorized a national magazine to publish the design under his name. That is a direct violation of federal copyright law." Arthur quickly flipped through the metadata, reports his professional arrogance rapidly dissolving as he recognized the undeniable legal stamps. "My client demands 100% ownership of the physical property." Grace continued, her tone relentless. "If you refuse, we will walk out of this room right now and file a multi-million-dollar commercial infringement lawsuit against Brandon and his entire corporate firm. We will depose his boss, Marcus. We will make his theft a matter of absolute public record." The silence in the room was incredibly heavy. The arrogant smirk was completely wiped from Brandon's face. He looked at Arthur, waiting for his expensive bulldog attorney to tear our argument apart. But Arthur was completely silent, his eyes scanning the irrefutable digital timestamps. He knew exactly what this meant. A copyright lawsuit involving his corporate firm would result in Brandon being immediately terminated and financially ruined. "You cannot do that," Brandon whispered, his voice suddenly sounding very thin and remarkably weak. "That is blackmail." "It is not blackmail, Brandon," I said, speaking for the very first time since he entered the room. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly steady. "It is the law. You took the credit for my genius. Now you will pay the invoice." He stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and emerging panic. The woman he thought was just a mute servant who picked out curtains was holding a legal blade directly to his throat. "That is just the first item," Grace announced smoothly. She turned the page. Arthur realized the physical property was rapidly becoming a lost cause. He quickly shuffled his remaining papers, adjusting his expensive silk tie as he tried to salvage his client's financial dignity. He immediately pivoted his strategy toward the liquid assets. "Fine," Arthur said, his voice losing some of its booming, aggressive resonance. "If the physical property ownership is currently contested, we will shift our focus to the marital savings. My client demands an immediate, equitable 50-50 split of all joint checking accounts, savings accounts, and shared investment portfolios." Grace did not miss a single beat. She reached into the heavy red folder and smoothly pulled out a single, highly detailed bank statement. She slid the paper across the polished steel table, stopping it exactly halfway between us and the opposing counsel. "We would be perfectly happy to divide the remaining joint assets," Grace said, her tone dangerously polite and perfectly level, "right after your client returns the $35,000 he illegally wired to Blue Horizon Consulting last Tuesday afternoon." Brandon physically jumped in his leather chair. The arrogant, composed color rapidly drained from his face for the second time that morning. He shot a frantic, terrified glance at his lawyer. "As I am sure you are well aware," Arthur Grace continued, steepling her fingers on the table, "Blue Horizon Consulting is a recently incorporated shell company. The sole registered agent on the public business filings is Diane Brandon's mother. Deliberately siphoning marital funds into a hidden third-party account during impending divorce proceedings is not just a standard breach of fiduciary duty. In this state, it is considered criminal dissipation of assets." Arthur stared down at the highlighted bank statement. He looked at the routing number, verified the date, and then he slowly turned his head to glare at Brandon. Brandon had clearly not told his incredibly expensive bulldog attorney about his clumsy amateur attempt at money laundering. "You are intentionally hiding money to manipulate the final settlement," Grace stated flatly. If you do not return the full amount, plus the standard interest by 5 o'clock today, we will gladly skip the family court and take this directly to a criminal judge. Arthur was officially sweating. His aggressive, dominating posture had completely collapsed. He began whispering frantically to Brandon, pointing aggressively at the highlighted transaction records and demanding a quiet explanation. The room felt incredibly small and suffocating for them. I sat perfectly still, breathing deeply, watching the man who had publicly humiliated me squirm under the crushing weight of his own financial incompetence. He was backed into an absolute corner, completely stripped of his corporate armor. Brandon slammed his hand down on the steel table, his face red with desperate, unhinged fury. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me, abandoning all pretense of professional behavior. "What about her?" Brandon yelled, his voice echoing sharply off the frosted glass door. "What about the $450,000 she has been secretly hiding in her private retirement fund? I want half of that money. It is marital property." Arthur looked at me, a brief flash of predatory hope returning to his eyes. But my shield was completely ready. The trap closed completely. I did not let Grace answer for me. I looked straight into Brandon's desperate, furious eyes. The quiet quitting was officially over. I was finally speaking for myself, and my voice was as cold, steady, and unbothered as a quiet winter morning. "You are referring to the $450,000 I earned entirely from my independent architectural contracts," I said, leaning slightly forward, holding his gaze. "The money I spent 10 years quietly investing and compounding while you were buying expensive golf clubs and paying for luxury dinners to impress your corporate colleagues." Brandon sneered, his hands gripping the edge of the steel table. "It does not matter who earned the money, Sarah. We are legally married. That makes it half mine." "No, Brandon, it absolutely does not," I replied, offering him a hollow, pitying smile. "Because those specific funds are held securely inside an irrevocable trust." I watched his brow furrow in deep, genuine confusion. He was a wealthy corporate manager, but he completely lacked the granular, specialized financial literacy of a true forensic auditor. "My late father established that trust for me entirely outside of our marital estate," I explained slowly, ensuring he absorbed the heavy impact of every single word. "It is a legally isolated entity. Federal law dictates that those assets belong exclusively to the trust itself, not to me as an individual, and certainly not to you. You have absolutely no legal standing to claim a single penny." I let the harsh reality of the situation sink deeply into his mind. I wanted him to vividly remember the rainy morning he had stormed into my office loudly mocking me for playing useless games on my laptop. I wanted him to realize that while he was shouting at me for not ironing his dress shirt, I was quietly securing a massive fortress of wealth that he would never ever be allowed to touch. "You spent a decade demanding that I shrink myself down," I said quietly. "You told your friends I was useless. You told your boss I just picked out curtains. But the absolute truth is I was the only one building a real foundation." Brandon looked at Arthur, his eyes completely desperate for a sudden legal loophole. "Tell her she is lying. Tell her we can break the trust." Arthur shook his head, slowly refusing to even look at his client. "An irrevocable trust predating the commingling of those specific funds is completely ironclad, Brandon. We cannot touch it." Brandon sank back into his heavy chair, looking like a completely deflated balloon. The devastating realization of his absolute defeat was written all over his pale face. He had lost the multi-million-dollar house. He had lost the stolen $35,000. He had lost the hidden retirement fund. But Arthur was not entirely finished. He opened his briefcase. Arthur was an incredibly expensive, highly sought-after attorney for a very specific reason. He did not like losing, and he certainly did not like being humiliated by opposing counsel in a mediation room. He took a deep, steadying breath, straightened his silk tie, and reached into the very bottom compartment of his leather briefcase. "This has been a very enlightening conversation regarding trusts and digital copyrights," Arthur said, his voice, regaining a smooth, highly dangerous edge. "However, it seems my client simply forgot to mention one very crucial, legally binding document." He pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper and slid it confidently to the center of the table. "This is a post-nuptial agreement officially dated August 14th of last year. In it, Sarah explicitly and voluntarily waives all claims to the Bellevue property and any future corporate earnings of my client. It is fully notarized and bears her verified electronic signature." Brandon sat up straight, a triumphant, wicked smirk spreading rapidly across his face. He had genuinely tried to cheat his way to a sweeping victory. He truly thought he had played an unbeatable trump card. The tension in the cold room spiked immediately. Grace frowned deeply, leaning forward to closely inspect the digital signature block on the printed page. I looked at the forged document, then I looked directly at Brandon. I did not feel a single ounce of panic. My heart rate did not elevate. I simply felt an overwhelming, profound sense of pity for his absolute staggering stupidity. I calmly unzipped the side pocket of my leather tote bag and pulled out my dark blue passport. I placed it gently on top of his forged agreement. I opened it to a specific page filled with bright official immigration stamps. On August 14th of last year, I said, tapping the dark blue ink stamp with my index finger, I was in London attending a sustainable architecture symposium. My international flight records, my hotel receipts, and the geolocation metadata from my phone confirm I was entirely out of the country. I looked directly at Arthur, whose face had suddenly turned the pale color of cigarette ash. The IP address used to generate that electronic signature came directly from our home network in Seattle. I continued softly, letting the silence amplify my words. Forging a digital signature on a binding legal contract is a federal felony. Presenting a forged document in a legal mediation is a severe ethical violation that will permanently cost you your law license, Arthur. Arthur stared at the open passport. He stood up so quickly his heavy chair scraped loudly against the floor. He aggressively shoved his legal papers back into his briefcase. I am officially withdrawing as your legal counsel effective immediately, Arthur snapped at Brandon, his voice trembling with genuine, unbridled rage. Do not ever contact my office again. Arthur walked out rapidly. Brandon was completely alone. Exactly 30 minutes after Arthur stormed out of the mediation room, Brandon signed the final dissolution agreement. He had absolutely no other choice. Without legal representation and facing massive criminal liability for federal forgery and financial dissipation, he completely surrendered everything. He waived all legal claims to the beautiful house, the joint accounts, and my protected intellectual property. 2 days later, I returned to the Bellevue Eco Home. A local police officer was parked silently in the driveway, arranged by Grace to ensure the property transfer went completely smoothly. Brandon had been granted exactly half an hour to collect his personal clothing and immediate belongings. I stood in the massive, sunlit kitchen leaning casually against the cool marble island. I watched Brandon drag 2 heavy suitcases down the floating glass staircase. He was no longer the arrogant corporate executive who had humiliated me in front of his colleagues. His tailored suit was heavily wrinkled, his hair was messy, and he looked incredibly tired and small. He stopped in the hallway, looking around the beautiful, expansive home he had so desperately tried to steal. He dropped his heavy bags and took a hesitant, pathetic step toward the kitchen. "Sarah, please," he said, his voice physically breaking. He actually had tears forming in his eyes. 10 years. We built a life together for 10 long years. You cannot just throw me out like trash. I made mistakes, but I can fix this. We can go to professional counseling. I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. The deep well of my empathy had completely dried up months ago. "You did not make mistakes, Brandon," I replied, my voice echoing coldly in the pristine space. "You made highly calculated decisions to exploit me, humiliate me, and legally steal from me. You only want counseling now because you finally got caught." He took another step forward, his hands raised in a desperate, pleading gesture. "I love you. You know I love you." I picked up my teacup, taking a slow, calming sip. "You do not love me. You love the conveniences I provided. You love the house I designed. You love the reflection of yourself when I was standing quietly in your shadow." The police officer stepped heavily into the doorway, tapping his radio. "Time is up, sir. You need to vacate the premises immediately." Brandon stared at me, desperately searching my face for a single ounce of forgiveness or hesitation. He found a completely locked door. He picked up his heavy suitcases, his shoulders slumped in total defeat, and walked slowly out of the beautiful glass house. I did not look back. The heavy door clicked shut. The immediate aftermath of the divorce was incredibly peaceful, but the severe, real-world consequences for Brandon were just beginning to dramatically unfold. My father used to say that a lie is a heavy debt, and eventually the universe always comes to collect the principal. 3 months after Brandon walked out of my house with his suitcases, his massive debt officially came due. Grace and I formally submitted the certified digital metadata and the federal copyright registration for the eco home design directly to the legal department of Marcus's corporate firm. We included a very polite, carefully worded legal letter advising them that any publication or commercial use of the design under Brandon's name would result in an immediate federal lawsuit. Corporate entities do not care about personal domestic drama, but they care deeply about immense financial liability. Marcus immediately launched a rigorous internal investigation. It took them less than 48 hours to realize Brandon had completely fabricated his involvement in the architectural project. He had brazenly lied to his boss, he had lied to their corporate partners, and he had exposed the entire firm to a massive legal risk. Marcus fired him by the end of the week. The architectural and development community in Seattle is wealthy, tightly connected, and incredibly unforgiving when it comes to intellectual theft. Word spread rapidly through the corporate networks. Brandon's reputation as a brilliant rising executive was completely obliterated. He was permanently blacklisted from every major development firm in the Pacific Northwest. With no corporate income, no joint savings to drain, and a massive mountain of personal debt from his luxury car leases and expensive suits, his fake empire rapidly collapsed. I heard through mutual acquaintances that his luxury sedan had been quietly repossessed by the bank. He could no longer afford the extravagant lifestyle he had so desperately tried to project to the world. Stripped of his stolen money and his fake prestige, he was forced to pack up his remaining belongings and move into the damp, unfinished basement of his mother's small suburban house. The man who had loudly laughed at me for being useless was now entirely dependent on his mother for basic shelter. He had foolishly traded a brilliant, supportive partner for a dark basement room. While his world rapidly shrank into a dark, pathetic corner, mine began to beautifully expand. I woke up early on a warm Saturday morning, the bright sunlight pouring into my quiet, stunning house. I walked out into the expansive backyard carrying a pair of gardening shears. The dark soil was incredibly rich. I finally began to plant. 6 months later, the Bellevue Eco Home was completely transformed. It was no longer a beautiful, pristine stage for a mediocre corporate manager to perform his daily illusions. It was now the official, bustling headquarters of my newly launched independent architectural firm. We were hosting a small, intimate launch party on the sweeping back terrace. The warm evening air was filled with the gentle scent of fresh pine and blooming jasmine. The guests mingling on the patio were genuine friends, brilliant contractors, and loyal clients who actually respected the complex reality of my work. Bella stood near the edge of the illuminated infinity pool, laughing brightly with a group of young, ambitious junior designers. She was wearing a vibrant yellow sundress, her posture perfectly straight. She looked absolutely nothing like the terrified, shrinking girl who had sat silently at that disastrous anniversary dinner. I walked over to her, holding a thick, cream-colored envelope in my hands. "I have something for you," I said softly, handing it to her. Bella opened it carefully. Inside was the official digitally stamped receipt from the university bursar's office confirming that her comprehensive 4-year tuition for the School of Architecture had been paid in full. There were absolutely no strings attached. There were no manipulative conditions or looming threats of withdrawal. Tears immediately welled in her eyes, but they were tears of profound, absolute relief. She wrapped her arms around my neck and hugged me incredibly tight. "Thank you," she whispered into my shoulder. "Thank you for everything." As I held my niece, feeling the immense weight of her anxiety finally dissolve, I noticed a familiar truck pull quietly into the wide driveway. David, the lead landscape engineer who had originally executed my incredibly complex garden designs, walked slowly up the stone path. He was a quiet, deeply observant man with calloused hands and kind, steady eyes. He did not immediately walk into the center of the crowd to loudly demand attention or network with the wealthy clients. Instead, he stopped near the edge of the terrace, kneeling down to gently realign a heavy brass planter that had shifted slightly off its perfect geometric axis. I walked over to him, offering a glass of sparkling water. He stood up, wiping his hands casually on his denim jeans. He looked at the towering glass walls of the house, then at the meticulously layered gardens, and finally he looked directly at me. "The design is absolutely flawless," David said, his voice quiet but incredibly sincere. "You thought of every single detail, Sarah. It is a profound privilege to build your visions." There was absolutely no arrogance in his tone. There was no subtle attempt to steal the spotlight or diminish my labor. It was just pure, unadulterated respect for my intellect. 1 exact year had passed since that terrible dinner. Might Thur go to cack. The next morning the house was incredibly peaceful. I sat in the sunlit kitchen sipping a cup of hot chamomile tea. Across the wide marble island, Bella was intensely focused on a thick sketchbook, her pencil flying confidently across the page as she drafted her very first structural concept. The quiet, rhythmic scratching of the graphite was the only sound in the beautiful room. It was the highly productive sound of a completely safe environment. I looked at my laptop resting quietly on the counter. The heavy encrypted financial spreadsheets and the aggressive legal documents were securely archived away on an external drive. I did not need to look at them anymore. The ruthless forensic audit of my marriage was officially closed. When you spend a decade standing quietly in the massive, demanding shadow of an incredibly arrogant man, you slowly begin to believe that the darkness is your natural habitat. You convince yourself that your endless, invisible sacrifices are simply the necessary currency required to purchase love and stability. You systematically normalize the deep psychological debt until it completely bankrupts your own soul. But Brandon made a fatal, catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed my profound silence was a permanent symptom of weakness. He did not understand that a brilliant, analytical mind does not stop working just because it is quiet. It simply shifts its strategic focus. He aggressively forced me to apply the exact same ruthless, calculating logic I used to build our financial wealth to systematically dismantle his toxic presence in my life. The greatest lesson I learned from that long, silent war was not about federal copyright law or the protective power of irrevocable trusts. It was a deeply personal realization about human value. Your true worth is never defined by how much you are willing to unconditionally sacrifice for someone who remains entirely ungrateful. Your value is strictly defined by your absolute courage to stand up, ruthlessly audit your own life, and permanently write off the toxic debts. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my warm tea. My financial portfolio was perfectly secure. My architectural firm was thriving entirely on its own merit. My talented niece was safe from manipulation. My life was finally operating at a massive, beautiful emotional profit. I set the cup down, I picked up a pencil and began to sketch beside Bella. The door clicked shut.